The Atlantic gale screamed across the Minch, carrying with it a horizontal sleet that turned the picturesque village of Loch into a blurred smudge of grey stone and white water. It was a day designed for staying indoors, ideally with a peat fire and a large pot of strong coffee, but PC Hamish Macbeth was currently standing knee-deep in a freezing burn behind the Halberton Smythe estate. He was not on duty, at least not in any official capacity that the Strathbane headquarters would recognise. He was engaged in the delicate, illegal, and highly rewarding task of borrowing a salmon from the strictly preserved waters of the local gentry. "Keep a sharp eye, Lugs," Hamish whispered to the dog sitting morosely on the bank. Lugs, a creature of indeterminate breed with ears that seemed to pick up signals from outer space, let out a pessimistic huff. Hamish's long, lanky frame was hunched over the water, his shock of ginger hair dampened into a flat cap of orange fuzz, just as his fingers brushed the cold, slippery flank of a fine 10-pounder. The peace of the Highlands was shattered. It wasn't the scream of an eagle or the roar of the wind, but the aggressive, high-pitched honk of a luxury car horn, followed by the sound of tyres churning expensive gravel into a muddy soup. Hamish sighed, letting the salmon flick its tail and vanish into the peaty depths. "Oh, well, there goes dinner, Lugs, and here comes the circus." The circus, in this instance, was the wedding party of Mr. Sterling Vane, a name Hamish already disliked before he had even met the man. Vane was a London property developer who had decided that a rustic Highland wedding was the perfect accessory for his third marriage. He had arrived in a fleet of black SUVs that looked like an invading armoured division, bringing with him a swarm of bridesmaids in silk dresses that were entirely unsuitable for the Scottish climate, and a collection of groomsmen who looked like they had been sculpted from expensive mahogany. As Hamish emerged from the bushes, looking like a particularly bedraggled scarecrow in his worn waxed jacket and muddy Wellington boots, he found himself face to face with the groom. Sterling Vane was a man who radiated the kind of self-importance that usually required its own zip code. He was currently shouting at a local crofter, Archie McLean, who was trying to deliver a crate of Highland spring water. "I told you, no plastic. It has to be glass. It's for the aesthetic," Vane bellowed, his face a startling shade of expensive tanning salon orange. He turned his gaze toward Hamish, his lip curling in a sneer of naked contempt. "And who are you, village idiot or local poacher? I pay enough in rental fees for this estate to expect the riff-raff to be cleared out." Hamish assumed his most vacant, simple-minded expression. He adjusted his cap, allowing a lock of ginger hair to fall over his hazel eyes. "I'm the law, sir. PC Macbeth. I was just... checking the water levels for public safety. Very dangerous, the runoff." Vane let out a short, bark-like laugh. "The law? Looks like you haven't seen a soap bar since coronation. Listen, Constable, I'm hosting the wedding of the season. I don't want to see a single scruffy policeman, a single stray sheep, or any of this Highland gloom near the marquee tomorrow. Do I make myself clear?" "Abundantly, sir," Hamish replied with a deceptive, slow-witted smile. "I'll just take my dog and my gloom elsewhere." He watched the SUVs roar away toward the hotel, splashing mud onto Archie's ancient tractor. Vane was a Sassenach of the most exhausting variety, the kind who thought that because he had bought a week's worth of Highland atmosphere, he owned the souls of everyone in it. "He's a man in a great hurry to be happy, Lugs," Hamish murmured as he began the long, wet walk back to the station. "And men in a hurry often trip over things they didn't bother to look at." Hamish headed for the Loch Hotel, hoping Mrs. Emma Jane would have the stove on. He needed a coffee to wash away the oily taste of Sterling Vane's arrogance. He had no intention of attending the wedding, nor did he intend to do any work whatsoever for the rest of the weekend. But as the wind howled through the crags of Tomnavulin, carrying the faint, discordant sound of a London DJ testing a sound system in a silk marquee, Hamish felt that familiar, annoying prickle at the back of his neck. Loch was about to host a celebration, but Hamish had a feeling that before the cake was cut, the only thing being celebrated would be a very permanent kind of silence. The following morning, The sleet had surrendered to a thick, suffocating fog that clung to the sides of the mountains like a damp shroud. Inside the police station, Hamish was attempting to coax a reluctant flame from a pile of damp peat, his thoughts lingering on the breakfast he wasn't having. He had just settled into his chair with a mug of coffee, black, bitter, and hot enough to scald the tongue, when the telephone on his desk gave a shrill, demanding ring. Hamish stared at it with the weary suspicion one might reserve for a venomous snake. He considered letting it ring until the caller gave up, but the persistence of the sound suggested that the Highland gloom he had promised Stirling Vane had finally manifested in a more tangible form. Lochdu Police. Hamish sighed into the receiver, his voice thick with a deceptive Highland lethargy. The voice on the other end was not the arrogant bark of the groom, but the hysterical, high-pitched sobbing of a young woman. It took several minutes of Hamish's calm, rhythmic och, nows and easy threads to determine that the caller was one of the bridesmaids, and that the wedding of the season had hit a terminal snag. Hamish whistled for Luggs, who was already waiting by the door with an expression of profound canine boredom. The walk to the Halberton Smythe estate was a sodden affair, the mist turning the world into a grey limbo where the only landmarks were the jagged silhouettes of the Scots pines. As he approached the great silk marquee that had been erected on the lawn, he saw that the aesthetic Stirling Vane had been so concerned about had been thoroughly ruined. The white silk was flapping dismally in the wind, and the mahogany-sculpted groomsmen were huddled together near the entrance, looking remarkably pale under their expensive tans. Hamish pushed his way past a weeping woman in a lilac dress and stepped into the marquee. The interior was a riot of white roses, crystal flutes and silver platters, but the centre of attention was the tiered wedding cake, or rather, what was left of it. The 5-story masterpiece of royal icing had been toppled, and sprawled across the wreckage was the groom himself. Stirling Vane was dead. He was dressed in a velvet tuxedo that cost more than Hamish's annual salary, but the elegance of the garment was marred by the fact that he was face down in a sea of lemon curd and sponge. His arms were spread wide, and his legs were tangled in a decorative silk garland. But it was the manner of his demise that made Hamish's hazel eyes sharpen with a sudden, keen intensity. Protruding from the centre of Vane's back was a heavy, silver-plated cake knife, the handle engraved with the Vane family crest. It was a bizarre, almost theatrical sight. The man who wanted everything to be perfect had ended up as the final, macabre decoration on his own wedding cake. "Oh, what a mess," Hamish murmured, more to himself than the gathered crowd. He knelt by the body, his long fingers hovering over the silk carpet but never quite touching it. He didn't need a medical degree to see that the knife had been driven home with a singular cold-blooded precision. He stood up, his gaze wandering the room. He noted the way a chair had been overturned near the head table, the single broken crystal glass by the floral arch, and the faint, lingering scent of a very expensive, very feminine perfume that didn't quite match the smell of the lemon curd. He also noticed that Vane's left hand was tightly clenched, as if he had been holding on to something, or someone, before he fell. "Don't touch anything!" A voice boomed from the entrance. Hamish didn't need to turn to recognize the sound of a gathering storm. It was the wedding coordinator, a sharp-featured woman named Clarissa, who looked as though she had been carved from a block of ice. She was followed by the bride, a woman half Vane's age who managed to look remarkably composed, although her future husband was currently a garnish. "I've already called the real police," Clarissa snapped, her gaze raking over Hamish's muddy boots and unkempt hair with naked loathing. "I expect they'll be here shortly to handle this tragedy. You, Constable, should probably go and wait by the gate. You're getting mud on the silk." Hamish assumed his most vacant, simple-minded expression. He adjusted his cap, allowing the peak to shadow his eyes. "I'll just be staying here for a moment, ma'am, to ensure the, evidence isn't disturbed by the wind. It's a very particular wind we have in Lochdu. It moves things, it does." He moved to the edge of the marquee, leaning against a support pole with an air of deceptive laziness. To the horrified wedding guests, he looked like a useless fixture of the landscape, But behind his hooded gaze, Hamish was already working. He saw the way the bride, Vanessa, was watching the silver-plated knife with a look that wasn't quite grief, but something more akin to a cold, calculating relief. He saw the best man, a nervous-looking fellow with a twitch in his left eye, trying to surreptitiously wipe a smudge of white icing from his sleeve. And he saw the silver-wrapped chocolate on the floor near the body, the same kind he had seen at the hotel only yesterday. The piece of whodunit had been shattered, and Hamish was profoundly annoyed. He had planned to spend the afternoon by his stove, perhaps reading a bit of a book and listening to the rain. Now he was trapped in a silk tent with a collection of wealthy Londoners who viewed him as an evolutionary throwback. He knew that, within the hour, the quiet lanes would be filled with the scream of sirens, and the beetroot-faced DCI Blair would arrive to shout, insult, and inevitably arrest the wrong person. "Aye, Lugs," Hamish whispered, patting the dog's head, as the first faint wail of a distant siren reached his ears. "The circus hasn't just arrived, it's set up its main tent, and I have a feeling that before the day is out, the inspector is going to find that a cake knife is a very difficult thing to explain away with a bit of shouting." He watched as the fog began to drift inside the tent, a grey finger of mist reaching out toward the body of Sterling Vane. The fatal secrets were starting to crawl out of the lemon curd, and Hamish knew that he would have to be the one to catch them before Blair trampled them into the mud. He straightened his cap and prepared his most helpful idiotic smile. The mooching investigation was about to begin, and in a room full of people who thought he was too stupid to understand their secrets, Hamish Macbeth was the only one who was truly listening to what they weren't saying. The sirens grew louder, a discordant shriek against the Highland silence, and Hamish prepared himself for the arrival of the most dangerous element of all, his superior officer. He took one last look at the clenched fist of the dead man and the silver chocolate wrapper, his mind already weaving the threads of a motive that had nothing to do with property development and everything to do with a very human, very Highland kind of revenge. He stood his ground as the first police car skidded to a halt outside, its tyres throwing up a spray of gravel that sounded like a final, mocking applause for the late Mr. Vane. The wedding was over, but the mystery was just beginning to rise. The sirens did not so much arrive as they did assault the Highland silence, a discordant, high-pitched shriek that sent a parliament of rooks exploding from the ancient oaks near the manor house. Within minutes, the manicured gravel driveway was being churned into a grey slush by the tyres of 3 white and blue patrol cars, and a black sedan that looked as though it had been driven through a peat bog. Hamish stood by the silk folds of the marquee entrance, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his waxed jacket, looking for all the world like a man who was struggling to remember his own middle name. Lugg sat beside him, his oversized ears flattened against the cacophony, his eyes fixed on the black sedan with a look of profound canine disapproval. The door of the sedan flew open with such violence that it nearly hit a decorative stone urn. Out stepped Detective Chief Inspector Blair. He was a man whose physical presence was defined by a neck that seemed to have been swallowed by his shoulders and a face that remained a permanent, angry shade of beetroot. Blair didn't walk, he stomped, his heavy brogues crushing the fine white snow and the delicate grass with equal disregard. Behind him trailed Detective Sergeant Anderson, a man who had long ago perfected the art of looking like he was apologizing for his superior's existence. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice echoing off the library wing and causing the weeping bridesmaids to flinch. "I might have known! A body drops in the Highlands. Who do I find standing over it? The village idiot with his mongrel dog. What have you done to the crime scene, you great lummox? Have you trampled any evidence between here and the harbour? I bet you've been sticking your ginger nose into the cake already." Hamish assumed an expression of wide-eyed, vacant helpfulness. He adjusted his cap, allowing it to sit at a particularly jaunty, unintelligent angle. "Oh, no, Inspector. I've been standing right here, keeping the wind off the decorations. I thought perhaps the cold might be bad for the royal icing, you see. It's a very delicate structure, or it was." Blair marched into the marquee and stared at the remains of Sterling Vane. His eyes bulged as they settled on the silver-plated knife protruding from the velvet tuxedo. For a moment, the DCI was actually silent, his mouth working like a landed fish as he processed the sheer absurdity of the sight. Then, he let out a sound that was half laugh and half snarl, turning his fury on the gathered wedding guests. "Right! Nobody moves!" Blair bellowed, ignoring that most guests were already frozen in horror. "Anderson, get the tape up. I want every one of these fancy-pants Londoners processed. And you, Macbeth, get out of my sight. Go and direct traffic or whatever it is you do when you aren't being a nuisance. I don't want to see you or that flea-bitten carpet on legs anywhere near this marquee for the rest of the day. Do I make myself clear? You're a useless peasant, and this is a high-profile case. It requires a mind like mine, not a man who smells of wet dog and damp peat." "Very clear, Inspector," Hamish said softly, his voice a model of humble sincerity. "I'll just go and check the road for ice then. Very important for the safety of the public. I wouldn't want the medical examiner to have a slip." He whistled for lugs and began to walk away, his head bowed as if in shame. To any of the officers watching, he looked like a beaten man, sidelined and insulted by the superior intellect from the city. But as soon as he reached the shadow of the great stone gateposts, his gait changed. The slumped shoulders straightened, and the vacant look in his eyes sharpened into a keen, predatory focus. He knew Blair was making a catastrophic mistake already. The DCI had already zeroed in on Archie McLean, the crofter who had been delivering water, simply because Archie was local, wore a tattered kilt, and looked suspiciously poor. "He wants us out of the way, lugs," Hamish whispered as they reached the narrow coastal road. The fog was thickening now, a white shroud that was rapidly erasing the footprints of the police. "And that suits us just fine. Blair will spend the next 2 hours drinking the wedding champagne and shouting at the best man. That gives us exactly the time we need to find out why a man like Sterling Vane ends up as a centerpiece." Hamish didn't head for the road. Instead, he took a sheep track that wound its way behind the hotel, leading to the back entrance of the village post office. He knew that the formal police would look at DNA and fingerprints, things that could be wiped clean or explained away. But in Lochdu, the truth was rarely found in a lab, it was found in the mooching. People talked to Hamish because they thought he was too stupid to understand their secrets, and he was more than happy to encourage that delusion. As he walked, his mind returned to the silver-wrapped chocolate he had seen near the body. It was a specific brand, Valmont's Vices, sold only in a few select shops in London and, curiously, stocked in the Lochdu Hotel's gift shop for the wedding party. He also thought about the perfume, the heavy, cloying scent of lilies. It was the favourite fragrance of Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, but she had been at home with the flu for 3 days. If that scent was in the marquee, it meant someone was wearing a perfume they had borrowed, or stolen. He reached the post office and stepped inside, the bell giving a cheerful ping that felt entirely out of step with the murder. Mrs. Kennedy, the postmistress, was leaning over the counter, her eyes sharp with the predatory curiosity that was her trademark. "So, Hamish," she began, her voice a conspiratorial rasp, "I hear the Sassenach has finally had his cake and eaten it too, and in a very permanent way. The word travels fast when Blair starts screaming at the seagulls." Hamish leaned against the counter, looking like he had all the time in the world. "News travels faster than a Highland stag, Mrs. Kennedy. It's a sad business, a very strange business. I don't suppose you've noticed any unusual mail for the Vane party lately? Perhaps something heavy, or something that smelled like, well, like lilies?" Mrs. Kennedy leaned in closer, her face a map of wrinkles and knowing smiles. "No lilies, Hamish, but there was a registered letter for the bride, Vanessa. It came from a legal firm in London. She was in here 2 days ago to pick it up, and she looked like she'd seen a ghost. She didn't even wait to get to the car to open it. She tore it right there on the pavement. And then there's the matter of the best man, Mr. Henderson. He's been sending telegrams like he's running a war, all to the same number in London. "Och, is that so?" Hamish murmured, taking a piece of peppermint from the glass jar on the counter. "And did you happen to see where Mr. Henderson was last night? Around midnight. He was at the hotel bar, drinking like a man who'd lost his soul," Mrs. Kennedy said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But he left around 12:30. He said he was going for a walk to clear his head. He didn't come back until 3 in the morning, and he was covered in white dust. He said it was flour from the kitchen, but it looked more like, well, like plaster of Paris." Hamish thanked her and retreated into the fog. The pieces were starting to move, though they didn't yet form a picture. He had a terrified bride, a best man covered in white dust, and a DCI who was currently convinced that a local crofter had committed a murder with a silver cake knife because he didn't like plastic bottles. Hamish knew he had to move fast. Blair would have Archie in handcuffs by sunset if he wasn't stopped, and the real killer would be halfway to London before the medical examiner had even finished his tea. He headed for the hotel, his gait slow and purposeful. He needed to find the best man, and he needed to see if the white dust on his suit was flour, plaster, or something much more expensive. The mooching investigation was in full swing, and in Loch silence was the loudest clue of all. He whistled for lugs, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the peace of his village was a fragile thing, and he was the only one left to mend the break. He would have to play the fool for just a little longer, until the trap was ready to be set. For now, the fog was his best friend, hiding his movements from the prying, angry eyes of DCI Blair. The damp chill of the fog seemed to seep through the very threads of Hamish's jacket as he made his way toward the Loch Hotel, cutting through the back gardens to avoid the main road, where Blair's patrol cars were still prowling like hungry sharks. He knew the hotel's layout better than the back of his own hand, particularly the route to the kitchens where a man could usually find a sympathetic ear and a hot plate of food. As he entered through the rear scullery, the air changed from the sharp, salty tang of the loch to the rich, yeasty scent of baking bread and the metallic steam of industrial dishwashers. Mrs. Emma Jane was there. Her face flushed a deep crimson as she directed a frantic team of waitresses who were currently trying to salvage the wedding breakfast for 100 traumatized Londoners. "Oh, Hamish, don't you start," she snapped, before he could even open his mouth, though she was already reaching for a thick ceramic mug. "If you're here to tell me the police are closing the dining room, you can tell that beetroot-faced beast Blair to come and say it to my face. I have a wedding party to feed, and dead groom or no dead groom, they're still hungry." She poured a jet of coffee that looked like liquid tar and shoved it across the stainless steel prep table. "I suppose you're here about the best man? He's in the residence lounge, or at least he was, looking like he's ready to jump into the loch." Hamish took a grateful sip of the coffee, the heat travelling down to his frozen toes. He leaned back against a cupboard, his hazel eyes drifting toward the pantry. Mrs. Kennedy mentioned he was a bit dusty when he came in last night. Flour, he called it. "I don't suppose your kitchen was open at 3 in the morning for a private baking session." "Don't be daft, Hamish," Emma Jane huffed, wiping a stray lock of hair from her forehead. The kitchens were locked tight at midnight. If Mr. Henderson was covered in white dust, it didn't come from my flour bins. And it wasn't just dust. One of the girls found a silk tie in the laundry bin this morning, navy blue with silver stripes. It was shredded, as if someone had used it to see through a thick branch, or perhaps something more stubborn. Hamish nodded slowly, his mind whirring behind his mask of deceptive lethargy. Navy and silver. That would be the Vane family colours. "I'll just take a wander into the lounge, Mrs. Emma Jane. I might have dropped a button, you see. Very important to find it." He shuffled out of the kitchen, lugs trotting at his heels with a practised air of invisibility. The residence lounge was a cavernous room filled with overstuffed leather chairs and the heavy scent of wood smoke and old whiskey. Near the window, staring out into the grey void of the fog, sat Peter Henderson, the best man. He was a twitchy, narrow-shouldered man whose expensive suit looked as though it had been slept in, and his hands were currently occupied with a glass of gin that was trembling rhythmically. Hamish wandered into the room, looking like a lost sheep in search of a fold. He approached the fire, rubbing his hands together and letting out a long, whistling breath. "A terrible day to be out, sir. The fog's so thick you could lose your own nose if you weren't careful. I'm PC Macbeth. I was just checking the structural integrity of the hotel. Very important in a storm." Henderson jumped nearly an inch out of his chair, slopping gin onto his trousers. "Police? I've already spoken to that screaming maniac in the marquee. I told him I didn't see anything. I was asleep. Sterling was my best friend, for God's sake." Hamish assumed an expression of profound, wide-eyed sympathy. He sat on the edge of a nearby ottoman, looking remarkably unintelligent. "Oh, of course, sir. A terrible loss. And him being such a successful man, too. It's a tragedy. I was just wondering, though, did Mr. Vane ever mention his hobby? Something to do with, well, cakes, or perhaps with lilies?" Henderson's eyes darted toward the door, then back to Hamish. "Lilies? What are you talking about?" Sterling hated gardening. He hated anything that required him to get his hands dirty. "Look, Constable, I really don't have anything to tell you. I'm just waiting for the fog to clear so I can get back to London." London?" Hamish murmured, his gaze falling on Henderson's hands. The man's fingernails were clean, almost too clean, as if they had been scrubbed with a stiff brush. But near the cuticle of his left thumb there was a tiny, stubborn trace of white, not flour, but something grittier. "I don't suppose you've been to the old ruins near the point? They say the plaster there is original, from the 18th century. Very historic." Henderson went deathly pale, his knuckles whitening around his glass. "I don't know any ruins. I told you I was in my room." "Oh, well, I'm sure you were," Hamish said, standing up with a heavy sigh. "I'll just leave you to your gin, then. It's a great healer, gin, though it doesn't do much for a guilty conscience. Or so the minister says. I'll see you later, Mr. Henderson. I hope your suit cleans up well. That white dust can be a devil to get out of silk." He backed out of the room with a humble nod, but as soon as the door closed, his gait sharpened. He headed straight for the hotel's gift shop, a small, cluttered room run by a local woman named Elspeth, who had a memory for faces that rivaled a police computer. He found her tidying a display of tartan scarves, her expression one of deep disapproval. "The wedding party, Elspeth," Hamish began, leaning over the counter. "Did anyone buy a box of Valmont's Vices in the last 24 hours? And did they happen to ask about the scent of lilies?" Elspeth didn't even look up from her scarves. The best man bought the chocolates yesterday morning, said they were a peace offering for the bride. And as for the perfume, he didn't buy it, but he was in here asking if we had any lily of the valley. When I told him we only had lavender, he looked quite cross. He said his contact had promised him the real thing. "His contact?" Hamish asked, his hazel eyes narrowing. "A woman," Elspeth said, finally looking up. "Not from the wedding party, a local or someone trying to look like one. She was here 3 days ago, wearing a heavy tweed cape and a hood. She left a package for Mr. Henderson. It smelled so strongly of lilies it made my eyes water." Hamish thanked her and stepped back into the lobby, his mind clicking into place. The white dust, the shredded tie, the registered letter for the bride, and the mysterious local woman with the lilies. It wasn't a property development murder. It was a plot of a much more intimate, much more Highland nature. He knew now that Archie MacLean was as innocent as a newborn lamb, but proving it to Blair would be like trying to explain the theory of relativity to a Highland bull. He needed to find that package, and he needed to know what was in the registered letter Vanessa had torn up on the pavement. As he stepped out into the fog, the first real drops of rain began to fall, turning the white world into a grey, weeping mess. He could hear Blair's voice in the distance, still shouting at a terrified waiter near the marquee. The fatal secrets were no longer hidden in the lemon curd. They were scattered throughout the village, and Hamish was the only one who knew where to look. He headed toward the post office bins, hoping the rain hadn't yet turned Vanessa's torn letter into a pulp. He needed the paper, and he needed it before the real police decided to start doing their jobs. Luggs let out a short, sharp bark, pointing his nose toward the harbour. The tide was coming in, and Hamish had a feeling that before it went out again, the Highland wedding would have one final, devastating surprise in store for everyone involved. He straightened his cap, whistled a low, mournful tune, and vanished into the mist. The rain began to lash down in earnest, turning the fine mist into a cold, driving curtain that drummed a rhythmic tattoo against the stone walls of the village. Hamish ducked into the lee of a fisherman's shed near the harbour, his hazel eyes fixed on the blue and green recycling bins situated just outside the post office. He knew he had to be quick. The village was small, and even in this weather, a policeman rummaging through the rubbish would be the subject of tea-time gossip within the hour. More importantly, he needed to avoid the sharp eyes of Detective Sergeant Anderson, who was likely lurking nearby, waiting for an excuse to report Hamish's eccentricities back to the red-faced Blair. With a quick glance around, Hamish moved with surprising agility for a man of his lanky build, lifting the lid of the bin and sifting through the damp envelopes and discarded flyers. He found it near the bottom, several fragments of heavy cream-coloured vellum, torn into jagged strips that had fortunately been shielded from the worst of the rain by a discarded newspaper. He tucked the pieces into the dry inner pocket of his waxed jacket, just as the sleek green rover belonging to Priscilla Halberton Smythe purred to a halt at the edge of the square. Priscilla stepped out, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed despite the humidity, and her eyes immediately found Hamish. She didn't look at him with the disdain of the Londoners or the irritation of Blair. She looked at him with the quiet, expectant curiosity of someone who knew that the lazy constable was currently the only person in Lochdu with a functioning brain. "I see you've taken up a new hobby in waste management, Hamish," she said, her voice cool and melodious as she approached. "Or is there something particularly fascinating about the post office's discarded correspondence?" Hamish assumed his most vacant expression, scratching his head and looking down at his muddy boots. "Och, just looking for a lost receipt, Priscilla. A very important one. For a new kettle. Station one has developed a most unfortunate whistle." Priscilla sighed, a small smile playing on her lips. "Don't bother, Hamish. I've just come from the manor. Sterling Vane was no popular man, even among his own wedding party. I overheard Vanessa, the grieving widow-to-be, arguing with the best man in the library. She was accusing him of failing to manage the situation and mentioned something about a prenuptial agreement that had gone missing. She didn't sound like a woman who had just lost the love of her life. She sounded like a woman who had just lost a very large bank account." Hamish leaned against the rough stone of the post office wall, the rain dripping from the peak of his cap. "A prenuptial agreement? That would explain the lawyer's recorded letter. But why the best man? Why would Peter Henderson be in charge of her legal papers?" "Because," Priscilla said, stepping closer to avoid a passing puddle, "Peter isn't just the best man. He's the Varney family's personal accountant. He knows exactly where every penny is buried, and more importantly, he knows who stands to inherit if Sterling dies before the vows are exchanged. In the Highlands, we call that a motive, Hamish." "Aye," Hamish murmured, his mind flicking back to the white dust on Henderson's cuticles and the shredded navy and silver tie. "And the accountant was covered in plaster of Paris last night. Now, why would an accountant be playing with plaster at 3 in the morning? Priscilla frowned, her brow furrowing in thought. "Plaster? The only place near here with fresh plaster is the old gazebo on the point. Sterling was having it restored as a surprise for the wedding photos. He wanted it to look like a Greek temple, all white pillars and marble floors. He had a local workman, old Angus, doing the casting for the columns only yesterday." Hamish's eyes sharpened. "The point. It's a lonely spot, Priscilla. Far enough from the hotel that no one would hear a struggle, but close enough for someone to get back before the morning alarm. And if there was something hidden in that plaster, something like a missing legal document or perhaps the real weapon, Blair is currently at the station trying to get a confession out of Archie McLean," Priscilla warned, her voice turning serious. "He found a silver-plated knife in Archie's tractor shed. He's convinced it's the set that matches the one in Sterling's back. He's shouting about forensic certainty and local savagery. If you're going to find the truth, you'd better do it before Archie spends the night in a cell in Strathbane. Hamish felt a cold, hard knot of anger in his chest. He knew Archie. The boy was a bit of a poacher and a champion sleeper, but he wasn't a killer. Planting a knife in a tractor shed was exactly the kind of clumsy move a panicked Londoner would make, thinking the local police were too stupid to look past the obvious. He looked at Priscilla, appreciative of the way she always managed to provide the missing piece of the social puzzle. "I need to get to the point," Hamish said, his voice losing its deceptive Highland lilt. "But I can't go in the police Land Rover. Blair has the keys and he'd see me coming a mile off. I don't suppose you'd be interested in a scenic drive in the rain? We could talk about the migration of the Highland seagulls." Priscilla's eyes flashed with a hint of dark humour. "Get in, Hamish. But if you get mud on the leather, I'm reporting you for criminal damage." As the rover glided out of the village, Hamish pulled the torn letter fragments from his pocket. With practised patience, he began to lay them out on his knee, piecing together the jagged vellum like a macabre jigsaw puzzle. The words were formal, cold, and devastating. It wasn't a prenuptial agreement. It was a notice of disinheritance. Stirling Vane had found out about an affair between his bride and his best man, and he had been planning to reveal it at the altar, right before castigating them both and cutting them off without a penny. "Fatal secrets indeed," Hamish whispered as the car climbed the steep track toward the point. He wanted a theatrical wedding, and he got a theatrical death. But who wore the lilies, Priscilla? Who was the woman in the tweed cape that Elspeth saw in the shop? "I don't know," Priscilla replied, her grip tightening on the steering wheel as the wind buffeted the car. "But I do know that Stirling's first wife, the one he walked out on 10 years ago, lives just over the hill in Drumnadroshit. She's a local woman now, very quiet, very bitter. She's the only one who would know about the scent of lilies being a Varney family tradition for funerals, not weddings." The car reached the summit of the point, the old gazebo looming out of the rain like a ghostly ruin. The white plaster of the new columns shone with an eerie, unnatural light against the dark sea. Hamish stepped out of the car, Lugs already barking at a shadowed figure moving near the base of the central pillar. The figure was draped in a heavy tweed cape, the hood pulled low, and in their hand was a heavy iron mallet. They weren't there to admire the view, they were there to break something open. Hamish felt the familiar prickle at the back of his neck. The best man had the dust, the bride had the motive, but the woman with the mallet had the history. He signalled for Priscilla to stay back, and began to move silently through the gorse. The lazy policeman replaced by a man who knew that in the Highlands, the past never stayed buried, even if you encased it in plaster. He needed a confession, and he needed it before Blair's sirens arrived to shatter the last of the evidence. The rain hammered down, washing the salt from the air, but the scent of lilies was suddenly everywhere, cloying and sweet, the smell of a vengeance that had been 10 years in the making. He whistled low to Lugs, the trap finally beginning to close around a truth that was far more twisted than a silver cake knife. The wind off the Atlantic whipped the heavy tweed of the woman's cape, as Hamish Macbeth moved with the silent predatory grace of a hill fox through the sodden gorse. He didn't use his torch. The occasional flicker of lightning over the Minch provided just enough strobe-like clarity to see the figure at the gazebo. She was striking the base of the freshly plastered column with a rhythmic, desperate intensity, the iron mallet ringing out a dull, muffled thud against the wet stone. Each blow was a testament to a frantic need to retrieve something hidden before the setting sun brought the inevitable discovery of the morning. Beside him, Lugs remained low to the ground, a shadow among shadows, his hackles raised but his bark silenced by a sharp, cautionary gesture from Hamish. The gazebo, intended to be a monument to Stirling Vane's vanity, stood as a grotesque skeletal structure against the weeping sky. The white plaster of the columns, still curing in the damp Highland air, looked like the bones of some ancient beast rising from the earth. Hamish knew that the best man, Peter Henderson, had returned to the hotel covered in this very dust. It wasn't flour from a kitchen, but the residue of a panicked late-night construction. He realized now that Henderson hadn't been the one to strike the blow that killed Vane, but he had been the one to help hide the evidence of a much deeper, much older betrayal. The accountant's practical mind had seen a half-finished Greek column and thought it the perfect sarcophagus for the things that could ruin them all. "It's a heavy tool for a lady to be wielding in a storm, Janet," Hamish said, his voice cutting through the roar of the rain with a deceptive, conversational softness. The woman froze the mallet mid-swing. She turned slowly, the hood of her cape falling back to reveal a face that was a map of Highland endurance and deep-seated grief. This was Janet McLean, Sterling Vane's first wife, the woman who had been discarded like a worn-out boot when Vane's fortunes had shifted toward the London property market. She didn't look like a killer. She looked like a woman who had finally run out of patience with the world. Behind her, the column showed a jagged crack where she had been prying at the seam of the plaster. "He was going to do it again, Hamish," Janet whispered, her voice a ragged contrast to the polished tones of the wedding guests back at the manor. "He was going to stand at that altar and humiliate that girl, Vanessa, just like he humiliated me. He didn't love her. He just wanted to destroy her because she dared to look at another man. He called it his final grand performance. He was going to read that letter, the one you likely have in your pocket, and leave her with nothing but the clothes on her back." Hamish stepped out from the gorse, his lanky frame silhouetted against the pale glow of Priscilla's rover. He didn't reach for his handcuffs. He simply stood there, a tall, bedraggled figure in a dripping wax jacket. "And Peter Henderson helped you, the man who was supposed to be the groom's best friend?" Janet let out a short, bitter laugh that was swallowed by the wind. "Peter is a coward. He's been in love with Vanessa for years, and Sterling knew it. He's been dangling that knowledge over Peter's head like a sword. Last night they were here, at the point. Sterling brought them here to show them the gazebo, the place where he said he'd reveal their sins to the whole of the Highlands. There was an argument. Sterling reached for a knife, one of the silver ones he'd brought for the cake, and Peter panicked. He pushed him. Sterling fell, but it wasn't the fall that killed him. He hit his head on the plinth. Hamish moved closer, his hazel eyes fixed on the cracked plaster. "But the knife was in his back when I found him in the marquee, Janet. And Archie McLean is currently at the station because a matching knife was found in his shed. Now, why would a silver knife travel from the point to a marquee and then to a tractor shed?" "Because Peter is an accountant," Janet said, her voice dropping to a low, mournful tone. "He thinks in balances and ledgers. He thought if he moved the body to the marquee and staged it as a crime of passion, the police would look at the wedding guests. He used his tie to drag the body into the back of a truck, and then he brought Sterling to the cake. But the knife was my idea. I found them here, sobbing over the body. I told them I'd help them hide the truth if they gave me the brooch, the Van family heirloom that Sterling had promised to Vanessa. It was mine by right, Hamish. It belonged to my grandmother. The scent of lilies was suddenly overpowering, a thick, cloying sweetness that seemed to emanate from the very cracks in the gazebo's floor. Janet reached into the folds of her cape and pulled out a small, silver-wrapped chocolate, a Valmont's Vice. She held it like a peace offering. Peter was so nervous he was eating these like they were oxygen. He must have dropped the wrapper when he was helping me lift the body. And the perfume. I wore it because Sterling hated it. He said it smelled like a funeral. I wanted it to be the last thing he ever smelled." Hamish sighed, a sound of profound weariness. He could see the whole wretched tapestry now. A bully of a groom, a cowardly accountant, a terrified bride, and a woman scorned who had stepped in to orchestrate the final macabre act. Peter Henderson had used the fresh plaster of the gazebo to hide the bloody clothes and the real weapon, the heavy iron mallet that had actually delivered the killing blow to Vane's temple before the knife was ever used to stage the scene. The silver knife in the marquee had been a red herring, a bit of theatrical misdirection designed to point the finger at a local savage like Archie, while the real evidence cured in the salt air of the point. "You should have come to me, Janet," Hamish said, his voice devoid of judgment but heavy with the weight of the law. "Archie is your own nephew. You let Blair take him because you wanted that brooch back. I thought Blair was too stupid to make it stick, Janet cried, the mallet slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the marble floor. I thought you'd see through it, Hamish. Everyone knows you're the only one in this village with eyes in your head. Hamish felt a familiar sharp pang of annoyance. Being underestimated was his greatest tool, but being relied upon by the guilty was a burden he hadn't asked for. He looked back at Priscilla, who was standing by the car, her face a pale oval in the darkness. She had heard enough to ensure that Blair's forensic certainty would be laughed out of court, but it wouldn't be enough to save Janet from the consequences of her own bitterness. The inspector is about to arrive, Hamish said, his ears picking up the distant rhythmic throb of a motor. It wasn't a siren, it was the heavy chug of a police boat coming around the headland. Blair had finally realized that the point was the only place the fog hadn't fully swallowed. He'll find the mallet in that column, and he'll find the brooch in your pocket. And then he'll spend the next 10 years telling everyone how he outmaneuvered the local criminal element. Hamish adjusted his cap, the peak shielding his hazel eyes from the stinging rain. The fatal secrets were finally out, and they were as grey and cold as the Highland sea. He had the accountant's dust, the bride's letter, and the first wife's mallet. It was a clean ledger, even if the ink was blood. He signalled to Lugs, the dog letting out a low, mournful whine that seemed to echo the tragedy of the whole affair. The wedding of the season was officially over, and the only thing left was the paperwork and the long, slow return to the deceptive peace of Loch-Dhu. Hamish knew he'd have to find a way to let Blair take the credit without letting him destroy Archie's life. A delicate dance that would require every bit of his lazy cunning. He watched as police boat lights swept across the gazebo, turning the white plaster into a blinding, accusatory glare. The trap was sprung, but as Hamish Macbeth looked at the weeping woman and the skeletal temple, he felt no triumph, only a desperate, urgent need for a very large pot of tea and a very long sleep. He began to walk toward the car, his boots squelching in the mud, already planning the exact words he would use to make DCI Blair feel like the smartest man in the world, while ensuring the truth was the only thing that actually survived the night. The scent of lilies lingered in the air, a ghostly reminder that in the Highlands, love was a rare thing, but vengeance was a perennial that never failed to bloom. The heavy thrum of the police boat's engine grew louder, vibrating through the wet soles of Hamish's boots as the beam of its searchlight swept over the cliffside, turning the falling rain into silver needles. Janet McLean stood broken before the cracked column, her hands empty now that the mallet had fallen, her shoulders slumped under the weight of the tweed cape that had once been her armour. Hamish did not move toward her with the aggressive haste of a city officer. Instead, he stood with a weary patience, his eyes fixed on the jagged opening she had made in the plaster. Inside the gap, nestled among the drying grit and the grey stone of the plinth, was the glint of gold and the deep, blood-red spark of a ruby. It was the Varney family brooch, an heirloom that had caused more misery than its weight in gold was worth. Lugs sat by Hamish's side, his ears cocked toward the shore where the distant, muffled crunch of tyres on gravel signalled the arrival of Blair's land-based contingent. "You've a long memory for a slight, Janet," Hamish said, his voice barely rising above the whistling wind. "But the law has a shorter one for reasons, and a longer one for results. Peter Henderson will be singing like a bird the moment he sees a set of handcuffs, and he'll point the finger to you to save his own tailored skin. He'll say the staging was all your idea, and that he was just a frightened man following orders. That accountant's mind of his is already balancing the books to see how much of the blame he can shift onto a local woman." Janet looked at him, her eyes glistening with a mixture of defiance and despair. Let him talk. He was the one who couldn't even push a man properly without crying about his silk tie. "Sterling was a monster, Hamish. He didn't just take my youth. He took my pride and tried to buy it back with a pittance. He thought he could come back here and flaunt his new life, his new bride and his new money, all while Archie and the rest of us struggled to pay the rent on land that should have been ours. I didn't mean to kill him, not at first. I just wanted him to feel the fear I felt every day for 10 years. But when I saw him there, laughing at Peter and Vanessa, something just snapped. The mallet was right there, left by old Angus. It felt like the weight of the hills was in my hands. Hamish sighed, a long, mournful sound that was swallowed by the Atlantic. He knew the story was true, or true enough for the Highlands. It was a crime born of a petty human grudge that had fermented in the damp and the dark until it turned into something lethal. It wasn't about property development or international finance. It was about a man who had forgotten where he came from, and a woman who couldn't forget where she had been left. But Blair wouldn't see the tragedy, he would only see a career-making arrest. Priscilla stepped forward from the shadow of the rover, her face a pale, elegant oval in the gloom. She looked at the brooch, and then at Janet, a flicker of genuine pity crossing her features. "The boat is docking at the jetty, Hamish. Blair will be here in 5 minutes. If you're going to do something, you'd better do it now. Once he sees her with that mallet and that jewellery, there will be no stopping him. He'll have her in Strathbane before the tide turns, and he'll never look at the best man or the bride again." Hamish adjusted his cap, his mind working through the tactical possibilities. He needed to protect Archie, but he also needed a result that would satisfy the DCI's bottomless ego. He eyed the cracked column and the mallet on the floor. "Priscilla, I need you to take Janet back to the car. Don't let her say another word. I'm going to have a little chat with the column before the inspector arrives. Lugs, stay with them." As Priscilla led the weeping woman toward the rover, Hamish moved quickly toward the gazebo. He took the mallet and tucked it into the deep pocket of his jacket. Then, using his own pocket knife, he pried the brooch from the plaster. He didn't put it in his pocket. Instead, he walked to the edge of the gazebo and tucked it into a small crevice in the underside of the stone floor, a place where it would be safe, but not immediately obvious. He then took the torn fragments of the disinheritance letter, the pieces he had retrieved from the bin, and scattered them near the base of the column, letting the rain dampen them so they looked as though they had been dropped in a struggle. Finally, he took a small, silver-wrapped chocolate he had taken from the hotel lounge and placed it prominently on the plinth. It was a Valmont's Vice, the best man's brand. He was setting a new stage, one that would lead Blair exactly where Hamish wanted him to go. He needed the DCI to focus on the accountant and the bride, for they were the ones who had moved the body and staged the scene. Janet would still have to answer for her part, but if Blair was convinced that Henderson was the mastermind, the local savage narrative would fall apart. Just as he finished, the first of the police lights crested the hill. The heavy, rhythmic stomping of DCI Blair echoed through the rainy night. He was shouting before he even cleared the gorse, his voice a rasping, beetroot-coloured roar. "Macbeth, you great ginger lout! I saw your lights from the harbour. What are you doing out here? I told you to stay by the road. If you've disturbed a single hair on this gazebo, I'll have you directing traffic in the Shetlands." Blair burst into the gazebo, followed by a bedraggled Anderson and 2 other officers. He paused, his eyes bulging as they settled on the cracked column and the scattered fragments of the letter. "What's this? What have you found? Is this the murder weapon?" Hamish assumed his most vacant, simple-minded expression, looking as though he were barely able to tie his own laces. "Oh, I'm not sure, Inspector. I was just following a stray sheep, you see. And I found these papers. They look very legal, sir. Very London. And there's this chocolate. I think I saw Mr. Henderson eating one just like it earlier." Blair lunged for the paper fragments, his hands shaking with excitement. "A disinheritance letter. My God, it's a motive. He was going to cut them. And the chocolate. Henderson. It was him. He killed Vane here at the point and moved him to the marquee to frame the locals. It's brilliant. It's forensic." "But, sir," Anderson ventured, looking at the cracked column, "the column has been hit with something. And what about the knife in Archie's shed?" "Forget the knife," Blair screamed, his face a terrifying shade of plum. "It was a plant. Henderson planted it to throw us off the scent. He's an accountant, Anderson. They're all devious. He probably used the mallet from the construction site and then hid it in the plaster. Macbeth, did you see anyone else? Any local ruffians?" Hamish scratched his head, looking thoughtfully at the horizon. "Och, only the best man, sir. I thought I saw him heading back toward the hotel earlier, looking very dusty indeed. White as a ghost he was." "Back to the hotel!" Blair roared, turning on his heel and nearly knocking Anderson over. "We've got him. We'll catch him with the dust still on his hands. And as for that girl Vanessa, she's an accomplice. They're in it together. Move, move, move!" The police scrambled back to their cars, the sirens beginning their discordant shriek once more. Hamish stood in the quiet of the gazebo, the rain washing the salt from the air. He watched the tail lights vanish over the hill, a small, sceptical smile playing on his lips. He had directed the beast toward the more deserving prey. Henderson and Vanessa would spend the night under the harsh lights of an interrogation room, and by the time they managed to explain Janet's involvement, Blair would be so deeply committed to his accountant mastermind theory that he wouldn't want to hear anything that complicated his victory. Priscilla emerged from the Rover, Janet still huddled in the back seat. "You've given him a new bone to chew on, Hamish." "But what about the brooch? And the mallet?" Hamish pulled the mallet from his pocket and looked at it. "The mallet is going for a swim in the loch. As for the brooch, it'll stay where it is until the dust settles. Janet, you're going home. You'll tell everyone you were out looking for your nephew, Archie. If the police return, you say nothing. Do you understand?" Janet nodded, her face a mask of exhaustion. "Why are you helping me, Hamish? I let Archie take the blame." "I'm not helping you, Janet," Hamish said, his voice cold and clear. "I'm protecting the village from a man who doesn't care for the truth. You'll have to live with what you've done, and in Loch Dhu, that's a harder sentence than anything a judge in Strathbane could give you. Now go, before the tide comes in and washes away the last of your luck." He watched the Rover drive away, leaving him alone with lugs and the ruined Greek gazebo. He felt a familiar, sharp pang of hunger. He had spent the day avoiding work, solving a murder and outmaneuvering his superior officer. All he had to show for it was a wet jacket and a cold station. But as he looked out over the dark water, he knew that Archie would be home by morning, and the wedding of the season would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. The trap was set, but the mooching investigation was far from over. He still had to find a way to make sure the credit shifted to Blair in a way that kept the inspector far away from Loch Dhu for the foreseeable future. He whistled for lugs, his heart heavy with the weight of the secrets he was now carrying, and began the long, wet trek back toward the village. The scent of lilies was finally fading, replaced by the honest, sharp smell of the sea. For Hamish Macbeth, that was a start. He needed a very large pot of tea and a very long sleep, but first he had a mallet to dispose of. The peace of Loch Dhu was a fragile thing, but for one more night it was safe. The heavy silence that followed the departure of the police sirens was soon filled by the rhythmic, mournful pulse of the Atlantic against the jagged rocks below the point. Hamish stood alone in the skeletal gazebo, the iron mallet heavy in his pocket, and the scent of lilies still clinging to the damp air like a persistent ghost. He knew that Blair was currently descending upon the Loch Dhu Hotel with the grace of a tidal wave, convinced he had unmasked a pair of metropolitan masterminds. But the accountant mastermind theory, while convenient for the DCI's career, was built on the shaky ground of planted evidence and Hamish's own carefully placed clues. To make the truth stick, or rather, to make the lie so attractive that Blair would never look elsewhere, Hamish had to ensure that Peter Henderson and Vanessa Vane were forced into a confrontation that would reveal their staging of the crime, even if it didn't fully reveal Janet's lethal blow. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish murmured, the dog shaking a spray of icy rainwater from his coat. "We have one more scene to stage before the inspector finishes his shouting." Hamish didn't take the road. He moved with a local's instinct through the peat bogs and over the dry stone walls, reaching the back of the Loch Dhu Hotel just as the chaos in the lobby reached its peak. He could hear Blair's voice echoing through the floorboards, a sound like a gravel crusher in a library. Peering through the rain-streaked window of the residence lounge, he saw Henderson and Vanessa huddled together, their faces lit by the flickering firelight, looking trapped and desperate. Blair was outside in the hallway, barking orders at Anderson to secure the perimeter, a phrase the DCI had likely picked up from an American television show. Hamish slipped through the scullery door, meeting Mrs. Emma Jane's startled gaze. She was holding a tray of sandwiches that looked as though they had seen better days. He put a finger to his lips, his hazel eyes sharp and focused. "Mrs. Emma Jane, I need you to do me a small favor. A very small, very loud favor. I need you to take those sandwiches into the lounge, and while you're there, I want you to mention, quite casually mind you, that the police have found the third person at the point. Tell them the police found a piece of jewelry that belongs to the Varney family, and they're bringing in scent dogs to track the woman who was wearing lilies." The proprietor's eyes widened, but she nodded, a glimmer of Highland shrewdness crossing her face. She knew Hamish wasn't the fool he pretended to be, and she had no love for the arrogant wedding party that had turned her hotel into a crime scene. "And what will you be doing, Hamish Macbeth?" "I'll be listening to the silence, ma'am," he replied, slipping into the service corridor that ran behind the lounge's heavy velvet curtains. He positioned himself behind the drapes, lugs sitting perfectly still at his feet. A moment later, he heard the rattle of the tray and Mrs. Emma Jane's voice, sounding remarkably innocent. "Here we are, then. A little ham for nerves. It's a terrible business, isn't it? The police are all over the point now. They say they found a brooch, a big gold thing, and they're looking for a woman in a tweed cape. They think she's the one who really did it for Mr. Vane." The door clicked shut behind her, and for a long moment there was nothing but the crackle of the fire. Then Peter Henderson's ragged, panicked breathing broke the silence. "A woman in a cape?" Henderson hissed, his voice trembling. "Vanessa, that has to be her, that local woman. She said she'd keep quiet if we gave her the brooch. She said she'd help us move him." "Shut up, Peter." Vanessa's voice was cold as a winter frost. "We gave her the brooch. We did exactly what she said. We moved him to the marquee. We used the knife. Everything was supposed to look like a local grudge. If the police find that brooch on her, she'll tell them everything. She'll tell them we were at the point." "We have to get it back," Henderson whimpered. "Or we have to get out of here. If Blair finds out we staged the body, we're finished. Disinheritance or not, they'll put us away for life." "We can't leave," Vanessa snapped. "The fog is too thick, and the police are everywhere. We have to make sure she doesn't talk. We have to tell Blair it was her. We tell him she blackmailed us, that she killed Sterling because of that old grudge, and we were too frightened to speak. It's her word against ours, Peter. We're the victims here." Hamish felt a cold, dry satisfaction. The trap was working better than he had hoped. By planting the idea of the third person and the brooch, he had forced the conspirators to admit to the staging. He didn't need them to admit to the murder. He just needed them to provide the narrative that would allow Blair to arrest them for the cover-up, while simultaneously providing the evidence that would clear Archie MacLean once and for all. But there was one final element needed to seal the trap. The stupid policeman had to make an appearance. He stepped out from behind the curtain, looking remarkably dishevelled, his cap slightly crooked and his eyes wide with a look of vacant surprise. Henderson and Vanessa bolted upright, looking as though they had seen a kelpie rise from the loch. "Och, excuse me," Hamish said, scratching his ginger hair. "I was just, looking for a stray button, very important buttons. I didn't mean to disturb your private conversation. It's a terrible thing, blackmail. The minister says it's a sin that never sleeps." Henderson's face turned from white to a sickly green. "How much did you hear, you oaf?" "Oh, just bits and pieces, sir," Hamish said, leaning against a mahogany sideboard. "Something about a brooch and moving a body. It sounds very complicated for a wedding night. I don't suppose you'd like to tell the inspector about it. He's just in the hallway looking for someone to shout at. He's very fond of a confession, is the inspector." "You have nothing," Vanessa snarled, her composure finally shattering. "It's your word against ours. You're just a village policeman who can barely read." "True enough, ma'am," Hamish murmured, his voice losing its Highland lilt as he straightened his posture. "But I have a mallet in my pocket that matches the wound on Sterling's head, the wound that Peter's navy and silver tie was used to wipe clean. And I have the fragments of a letter that says you were both being cut off without a penny. In the Highlands we call that a motive, and we call the rest of it a life sentence." Before they could respond, the door to the lounge was kicked open with such force it hit the wall with a bang. DCI Blair stood there, his face a glorious, terrifying shade of magenta, having heard the final, damning exchange from the hallway where he had been lurking, led there by a well-timed accidental tip from Anderson. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, but for once the anger was directed past the constable and toward the cowering couple. "You've done it now, staging a body, blackmail. I've got you on tape, you London filth. Anderson, get the cuffs. We have the accountant and the bride. It's the crime of the century, and I've cracked it wide open." As Blair and his team descended on the pair, Hamish quietly backed toward the door, lugs following at his heels. He saw the look of utter triumph on Blair's face, the look of a man who was already seeing his name in the national papers. The inspector didn't even notice as Hamish slipped out of the room, leaving the accountant mastermind theory to take its final, irrevocable form. The trap was set, the guilt was assigned, and the real killer, a woman whose heart had been broken 10 years ago, would be left to the mercy of her own conscience in a village that looked after its own. Hamish walked out into the rain, his heart heavy but his mind at ease. Archie would be free, and Blair would be too busy with his high-profile arrest to ever bother Lochdu again. All that remained was the final shift of credit and a very, very long sleep. He headed for the harbour, the mallet still heavy in his pocket, ready for its final journey into the deep. The roar of DCI Blair's voice inside the residence lounge was eventually muffled by the heavy oak doors, but the vibration of his triumph seemed to rattle the very foundations of the Lochdu Hotel. Hamish Macbeth did not linger to watch the formal arrests. He had seen enough of Blair's detective work to know that the accountant and the bride were currently being handled with all the subtlety of a landslide. Instead, he slipped through the side entrance and back into the relentless Highland rain, the cold water washing away the cloying scent of lilies that had haunted his nostrils since he first entered the marquee. He moved toward the harbour, the iron mallet still weighted in his pocket, a physical reminder of Janet McLean's desperation and the dark undercurrents that ran beneath the surface of the village's quiet life. He knew that for Blair the case was as good as won, but for Hamish there was still the matter of the final confrontation, not with the villains he had trapped, but with the fallout of the truth he had chosen to steer. The pier was deserted, the fishing boats bobbing rhythmically in the swell of the tide, their masts creaking like a chorus of tired old men. Hamish reached the end of the stone jetty and pulled the mallet from his pocket. It was a crude, heavy thing, its surface pitted by years of honest labour before it had been turned to a lethal purpose. He looked at it for a long moment, thinking of Janet and the 10 years of bitterness that had culminated in a single crushing blow at the point. He didn't believe in the kind of justice that Blair dispensed, the kind that looked for a trophy and a headline. He believed in the peace of the glen, and sometimes that peace required a bit of a secret. With a sharp flick of his wrist, he sent the mallet spinning into the dark waters of the loch. It vanished with a dull, heavy splash, leaving nothing behind but a few widening ripples and the sound of the rain. "Oh, well," Hamish murmured, "more to lugs than the wind. That's the end of it. Let the sea keep what the law doesn't need." But as he turned to leave the pier, a figure emerged from the shadows of a stack of lobster creels. It was Peter Henderson. He had somehow slipped away from the chaos in the lounge during the initial scramble of Blair's entry, his desperation giving him a fleet-footedness he hadn't possessed an hour ago. He was soaked to the bone, his expensive suit clinging to his narrow frame like a second skin, and in his hand he held a jagged shard of glass, the base of the broken crystal flute Hamish had noticed earlier in the marquee. His eyes were wide and wild, the look of a man who had realized that his world of ledgers and balances had been irrevocably tipped into the red. "You," Henderson hissed. his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and rage. "You did this. You and your stupid Highland act. You set us up. You planted those papers. You told Blair about the dust." Hamish stood his ground, his lanky frame remarkably steady against the gale. He didn't reach for his baton. He didn't even raise his hands. He simply looked at the best man with a dark, sceptical pity. "I didn't plant the truth, Mr. Henderson. I just made it easier for the inspector to find. You moved the body. You staged the knife. You let a boy like Archie take the blame for your own cowardice. You didn't strike the blow, but you carried the weight of it, and in the Highlands the weight is what breaks you." Henderson lunged, the glass shard glinting in the pale light of a harbour lamp. He wasn't a fighter, but the adrenaline of a cornered animal made him dangerous. Hamish, however, was far more physically capable than his lazy reputation ever suggested. He stepped to the side with the fluid grace of a stag, caught Henderson's wrist in a grip of iron, and used the man's own momentum to spin him around. With a sharp, practiced twist, he disarmed the accountant and pinned him against the cold stone of the sea wall. "Listen to me, you foolish man," Hamish said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl that silenced even the dog. "You're going to go back into that hotel, and you're going to tell the inspector exactly what you did. You're going to tell him about the staging and the move. And if you're smart, really smart the way an accountant should be, you'll say it was all your idea to protect the bride. You'll be a hero in the tabloids, a romantic fool who did it for love. It'll get you 5 years instead of 15. "And the woman?" Henderson gasped, his face pressed against the wet granite. "What about Janet? She's the one who—" "There is no woman," Hamish interrupted, his grip tightening just enough to make his point. "There is only an arrogant groom, a terrified bride, and a best man who tried to be clever. If you mention Janet McLean, I'll find the mallet, and I'll make sure the forensics people find your fingerprints all over it. Do you understand? The Highlands have a long memory, Mr. Henderson, and mine is the longest of all." The fight went out of Henderson then, his body sagging against the wall as the reality of his situation finally settled in. He was a man of the city, a man who lived by rules and records, and he found himself utterly defeated by a man who lived by the wind and the tide. He nodded slowly, a sob escaping his throat that was lost in the roar of the sea. Hamish let him go, stepping back as the sound of running boots approached the pier. It was Anderson, leading a pair of officers, their torches cutting through the gloom. They fell upon Henderson with the grim efficiency of the law, but Hamish didn't stay to watch the final act. He whistled for lugs and began to walk back toward the village, his heart heavy but his mind clear. He had protected Janet, not out of a sense of legality, but out of a sense of belonging. She was a daughter of the Glen, and Sterling Vane had been an interloper who had brought nothing but misery. As he reached the edge of the square, he saw Blair emerging from the hotel, his chest puffed out so far he looked as though he might burst his buttons. He was shouting into a mobile phone, likely calling the chief constable to claim the glory of the double arrest. He saw Hamish and let out a bark of derisive laughter. "Macbeth, you're still here? I thought you'd be off poaching somewhere." "Well, you can tell your little village that the law has prevailed. I've got the accountant, and I've got the widow. It's a clean sweep, and I did it all without your help. You're still a useless peasant, Macbeth, but at least you were around to see how a real detective works." "Aye, Inspector," Hamish said, his voice returning to its soft, deceptive lilt. "A grand bit of work. Truly grand. I'm just a pair of eyes, sir. I'm glad you were here to make sense of it all. I'll just go and check on the road now. Very important, the road." He watched as Blair climbed into his sedan, the sirens beginning their final, triumphant shriek as the convoy headed towards Strathbane. The fatal secrets were being driven away, leaving Loch Dhu to its silence and its snow. Hamish stood in the middle of the square, the rain finally beginning to turn to soft, fat flakes of sleet. He felt a familiar, sharp pang of hunger. He had spent the day avoiding work, solving a murder, and outmanoeuvring a monster, and all he had to show for it was a wet coat and a cold station. But as he looked at the lights of the cottages, he knew that Archie would be sleeping in his own bed tonight, and that Janet would be sitting by her fire, her secret safe in the dark waters of the loch. He headed for the station, his gait slow and purposeful. He needed a very large pot of tea and a very long sleep, but first he had a logistical report to avoid. The peace of Loch Dhu was fragile, but for another night it was his to guard. He whistled a low tune, a Highland air that spoke of lost causes and long winters, and vanished into the night. The following morning the Highlands decided to apologize for the previous day's violence with a sky so clear and blue it looked like a pane of glass. The sleet had vanished, replaced by a crisp frost that turned the village of Loch Dhu into a glittering toy town. Hamish Macbeth stood in the small, cramped office of the police station, the smell of damp wool and stale coffee hanging heavy in the air. He was staring at a stack of official forms that required his immediate attention, but his mind was elsewhere, specifically on the delicate task of ensuring he remained exactly where he was. The sound of a heavy, self-important tread on the wooden porch outside signalled the arrival of the final act. DCI Blair burst through the door, his face no longer purple with rage but glowing with the smug, oily satisfaction of a man who had already seen his name in the early edition of the Press and Journal. "Well, Macbeth," Blair barked, slamming a folder onto Hamish's desk. "The suspects are in the cells at Strathbane. Henderson is singing like a choir boy, and the widow is blaming everyone from the caterer to the Crown. It's a clean sweep, a masterpiece of detective work, if I do say so myself. I've just come from a briefing with the Chief Constable, and he's delighted. Absolutely delighted." Hamish assumed his most vacant, bovine expression. He looked at the folder as if it were a strange and confusing artifact from a lost civilization. He adjusted his cap, allowing a lock of ginger hair to fall over his forehead in a way that made him look particularly dim-witted. "Oh, that's grand news, Inspector. Truly grand. The village will be that relieved to know the masterminds are behind bars. I was just telling Lugs here that it takes a city mind to see through all that Highland fog. I was quite lost myself, what with the sheep and the rain." Blair leaned across the desk, his eyes narrowing with a predatory sort of glee. The chief was so impressed that he mentioned a promotion for the officer responsible for the tactical breakthrough. "He's talking about a sergeant's post in Inverness. High-profile Macbeth. Lots of paperwork, lots of traffic, and a desk in a room with no windows." Hamish felt a cold lump of dread settle in his stomach. A promotion to Inverness was his personal version of hell. It meant noise, concrete, and the constant suffocating oversight of men like Blair. He had to kill the idea before it could take root in the chief's mind. He let out a long, slow sigh, looking remarkably defeated. "Oh, a promotion," Hamish murmured, his voice thick with deceptive humility. "I'm sure the man who thought of the accountant theory deserves it, sir. But I have to be honest with you, Inspector. I was so confused yesterday. I kept thinking it was the crofter, Archie, if it hadn't been for your brilliant direction, telling me to check the point and mentioning that forensic certainty about the best man. I'd still be staring at the sea. It was your lead on the disinheritance letter that really cracked it. I was just a pair of legs for your brain, sir." Blair's chest puffed out so far that a button on his shirt looked to be under considerable structural strain. He took a deep breath, the praise acting like a tonic to his massive ego. "Well, Macbeth, I suppose I was quite sharp yesterday, the way I connected the white dust to the gazebo. It was a bit of a stroke of genius, wasn't it? And the letter, yes, I saw the motive the moment I stepped into that marquee." "Exactly, sir," Hamish said, leaning forward as if sharing a profound secret. "In fact, I wrote up a small draft for the official report, just to save you the time, busy man that you are. I made sure to emphasize how you directed the entire operation from the first siren to the final arrest. I mentioned how you intuitively sensed the staging of the body. If the chief sees this, there'll be no doubt who the sergeant in Inverness should be. A man of your talents is wasted in Strathbane, sir. You need the big city. You need the limelight. He slid a sheet of paper across the desk. It was a masterpiece of creative writing, portraying Blair as a cross between Sherlock Holmes and a tactical genius, while reducing Hamish's role to that of a bewildered assistant who had spent most of the day looking for a lost button. Blair scanned the paper, his eyes lighting up as he read the glowing descriptions of his own brilliance. "You've got a good eye for detail, Macbeth," Blair said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "I suppose it's only fair that the report reflects the reality of the command structure. I did provide the strategic oversight after all. It's my career on the line when things go wrong, so it's only right I take the credit when they go right." He tucked the report into his jacket with a sharp nod. "I'll take it from here. I'll make sure the chief understands the level of expertise involved. And don't worry about that promotion. I'll tell them you're far too valuable here in Loch-Dhu. Essential local knowledge, I'll call it. Can't have the village falling apart because its only constable is off in the city, can we?" "You're a very thoughtful man, Inspector," Hamish said, a small, sceptical smile playing on his lips that Blair completely failed to notice. "I'd be that grateful to stay. I'm not much for the bright lights, you see. I like the quiet." Blair let out a bark of laughter, already halfway to the door. "Quiet is all you'll ever have, Macbeth. You're a lazy peasant with no ambition, but you know your place. I'll see you when I'm a superintendent." He slammed the door behind him. A moment later, the black sedan roared away, tires spitting gravel as it sped toward a future of city desks and self-importance. Hamish stood at the window, watching the dust settle. He felt a profound sense of peace. He had successfully manipulated the most arrogant man in the Highlands into doing him the greatest favour possible, leaving him alone. "He's gone, Lugs," Hamish whispered, the dog letting out a soft, satisfied whine. "He's off to be a hero in Inverness, and we're off to see about a salmon." He reached into his drawer and pulled out the fragments of the Varney family history he hadn't shared with Blair, the small silver-wrapped chocolate he'd found in Janet's pocket, and the memory of the look in her eyes. He knew that justice in Loch-Dhu was a complicated living thing. Henderson and Vanessa would pay for their staging and their greed, and Janet would live with the silent weight of her vengeance in a cottage that was now finally hers again. The fatal secrets were buried under a layer of official reports and Blair's vanity, and that was exactly where they belonged. Hamish approached the stove and began to coax a flame from the peat. The hunger he had felt all day was finally being addressed. He had a bit of stew in the pantry and a fresh loaf of bread from Mrs. Emma Jane. He didn't need a medal, a promotion, or a mention in the papers. He had his station, his dog, and the long, beautiful silence of the Highlands. As the station began to warm, he sat in his old wooden chair, the lazy policeman once again at rest. He had protected his village, his neighbour, and his own quiet life, and for Hamish Macbeth, that was the only victory that ever truly mattered. He closed his eyes, the ticking of the clock the only sound in the room, and prepared for a very long, very well-deserved sleep. The roaring departure of DCI Blair's sedan left a silence in the Loch-Dhu police station that was as heavy and comforting as a thick woolen blanket. Hamish Macbeth stood by the window for a long moment, watching the dust motes dance in a stray beam of afternoon sunlight that had managed to pierce the thinning Highland clouds. The frantic energy of the wedding, the sharp, cloying scent of lilies, and the booming, beetroot-faced arrogance of his superior officer were all receding into the realm of village gossip. He felt a deep, bone-weary satisfaction. By handing Blair the credit for the accountant mastermind theory, he had ensured that the inspector would be far too busy preening in front of the press in Strathbane to bother with the mundane realities of a small village station. Hamish was, for all intents and purposes, a free man again. He turned back to the room, his eyes falling on the tattered remains of the morning's paperwork. Lugs, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, trotted over and nudged Hamish's hand with a wet, cold nose, his tail thumping rhythmically against the floorboards. It was the signal for the transition from the frantic pace of the law to the steady, restorative pace of the Highlands. Hamish reached for his kettle, filling it with the soft, peaty water that tasted of the hills, and set it on the stove. As the blue flames licked the blackened metal, he began to clear the desk, sweeping the remnants of the vain investigation into a bottom drawer where they would likely remain until the end of time. There was a quiet knock at the door, and before Hamish could answer, Priscilla Halberton Smythe stepped inside. She looked as elegant as ever in a tailored tweed jacket, though her eyes held a spark of knowing amusement as she surveyed the scene. She didn't need to ask how the meeting with Blair had gone. The absence of shouting and the peaceful set of Hamish's shoulders told her everything she needed to know. She walked over to the small table by the window and sat down, her presence filling the cramped office with a scent of expensive soap and fresh air that was a far cry from the murder scene at the Marquee. "I saw the black sedan speeding toward the main road," she said, her voice a cool, melodic contrast to the whistling kettle. "He looked like a man who had just inherited a kingdom. I take it you've managed to convince him that he's the greatest detective since Sherlock Holmes." Hamish leaned against the mantelpiece, a small, sceptical smile playing on his lips. "Och, it didn't take much convincing, Priscilla. The inspector has a very high opinion of himself, and I just gave it a little nudge in the right direction. He's convinced he's cracked the case of the century. He's already planning his victory speech for the chief constable. He's going to be so busy being famous that he won't have time to notice that the lazy constable is still sitting in the same chair he left him in." Priscilla laughed, a light silver sound. "And Archie? I saw him at the harbour earlier, looking a bit dazed, but very much a free man. I assume Blair found a more sophisticated suspect to focus on?" "Aye," Hamish murmured, pouring the boiling water into a teapot. "The best man and the bride are currently providing all the sophistication the inspector requires. They'll be tied up in legal knots for months, and by the time the truth of the staging comes out, Blair will be so committed to his version of events that he'll never admit he was steered. Archie is back to his sheep, and Janet is back to her silence." He brought 2 mugs to the table, the tea dark and strong. For a while they sat in a comfortable silence, watching the shadows lengthen over the village square. The fatal secrets had been tucked away, hidden behind the vanity of a city policeman and the quiet loyalty of a Highland community. The village was returning to its natural state, a place where the past was a living thing and where the law was often less important than the survival of the glen. "You're a devious man, Hamish Macbeth," Priscilla said, looking at him over the rim of her mug. "You saved that woman, you saved the boy, and you saved your own neck, all while looking like you were struggling to count your fingers. But tell me, do you ever regret it? Letting the credit go to a man who treats you like a servant?" Hamish looked out at the loch, where the water was turning a deep, bruised purple in the twilight. "Regret? Och, no, Priscilla. Credit is a heavy thing. It comes with expectations and promotions and people looking at you through a magnifying glass. I'd rather be the useless peasant who knows where the salmon are than the brilliant detective who can't see the mountains for the paperwork. In Loch Dhu, a man's worth isn't measured by the stripes on his arm, but by the peace he keeps, and it's very peaceful tonight." As the last of the daylight faded, Priscilla stood up to leave, pausing at the door to look back at him. "I suppose you'll be off to the hotel for a bit of a celebratory drama later?" "Maybe," Hamish said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "But first I think Lugs and I have a bit of a date with a certain salmon pool. The rain's stopped, the moon's up, and I have a feeling the fish are as relieved as I am that the wedding is over." When the door closed behind her, Hamish didn't immediately move to the door. He sat for a moment longer, enjoying the absolute stillness of the station. The mooching investigation was officially over. He had eaten the scones, drunk the tea, and listened to the whispers, and he had come out the other side with his world intact. He reached for his wax jacket, the iron mallet now at the bottom of the loch, and the disinheritance letter, a forgotten scrap in Blair's pocket. He was just a village policeman again, a man of simple needs and hidden depths, ready to return to the deceptive laziness that was his greatest shield. He whistled for Lugs, and the 2 of them stepped out into the crisp, cold night. The stars were beginning to appear, bright and sharp over the peaks of Tomnavulin. The air was clean, the scent of lilies entirely replaced by the honest smell of peat and sea salt. As they headed for the path behind the manse, Hamish felt the familiar, pleasant weight of his own insignificance. He had no headlines to chase, and no superiors to please. He had only the Highland night and the promise of a quiet tomorrow. He began to hum a low tune, a song about a wandering piper and a long winter. As he vanished into the shadows of the pines, the only sound was the steady, rhythmic crunch of his boots on the frost, the sound of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. The case was closed, the village was safe, and for Hamish Macbeth, the real work of doing nothing was finally ready to begin. The moon rose high over the Minch, casting a silver path across the water that seemed to lead straight to the heart of the village. Hamish Macbeth stood on the small stone jetty, his lanky frame hunched against the biting frost, but his heart was lighter than it had been since the neon-orange SUVs first descended upon Loch Dhu. In his hand, he held a small, weathered stone he'd picked up from the point, a fragment of the very plinth where Stirling Vane had met his theatrical end. With a practiced flick, he tossed it into the deep, watching the ripples vanish into the dark. The fatal secrets of the Vane family were now exactly where they belonged, at the bottom of the loch, alongside the iron mallet and the hubris of the London elite. He turned and walked back toward the police station, lugs trotting contentedly at his heels. The village was silent, the windows of the cottages glowing with the warm amber light of peat fires. Inside the station, the stove was still humming, and the scent of the strong tea he'd shared with Priscilla lingered in the air. Hamish didn't reach for his notebook or the official report forms. Instead, he moved to the small cupboard in the corner and pulled out a tin of his favourite stew. He shared a generous portion with Lugs, the dog's tail thumping a steady beat of gratitude against the floorboards. As the stew simmered, Hamish sat in his old wooden chair, the one with the seat worn smooth by years of strategic contemplation. He thought of Janet McLean, sitting in her own cottage just over the hill. She would be safe now, her secret protected by the very man Blair had called a useless peasant. He thought of Archie, who would be back at the harbour tomorrow, his name cleared and his dignity restored. And he thought of Blair, who was likely at that very moment holding court in a Strathbane pub, basking in the glow of a brilliant arrest that had been handed to him on a silver-plated cake platter. "Aye, Lugs," Hamish murmured, the firelight dancing in his hazel eyes. "The inspector has his promotion, the accountant has his cell, and we have the quiet. It's a fair trade, all things considered." He reached for a tattered book on the side table, but before he could open it, he caught sight of the small silver-wrapped chocolate he had kept as a final souvenir of the wedding of the season. He unwrapped it slowly, the foil crinkling in the silence. He popped the Valmont's Vice into his mouth, savouring the rich, dark sweetness. It was the only thing from the Vane estate that hadn't left a bitter aftertaste. The mystery was solved, the credit was shifted, and the deceptive laziness that was Hamish's greatest shield was firmly back in place. He leaned back, closing his eyes as the warmth of the station enveloped him. Tomorrow, there would be poaching to consider, coffee to mooch at the hotel, and the long, beautiful stretch of the Highland winter to enjoy. But for tonight, there was only the peace of the glen and the satisfaction of a job done in a way that no city detective would ever understand. The Highland wedding had ended in a funeral, but for Loch Dhu, the rhythm of life remained unchanged, slow, steady, and full of secrets that only the hills would ever truly know. Hamish Macbeth, the smartest man in the room whom everyone took for a fool, drifted off to sleep with a faint, sceptical smile, perfectly content to stay exactly where he was.